Welcome everyone to I-Corps' August webinar. We appreciate your joining us today and hope that you're having a great end of the summer. If you're in the US, summer is concluding. My name is Linda Nelson. I am the president of I-Corps, and I am coming to you today to talk to you about strategies to increase resilience and the work that we're doing kind of behind the scenes on this as we publish 22316 on organizational resilience principles and attributes, and as we are currently working on a draft document on organizational resilience policy and strategy. We really have one objective today. There was probably a dozen that I could have put in here, but I wanted really the focus of this webinar is to really dig deep into the meaning and understanding of the I-Corps organizational resilience model, and then look at what strategies look like. So we're going to look at those attributes in more resilient organizations, there's 9 of them, and then look at what might be potential strategies for how to increase the resilience of your organization for specific reasons. As usual, the recording of the webinar will be available on the webinar page in 2 days. I get a question every month about making the slides available. We do not make the slides available, but we do share the webinar both on our webinar page of our website and on YouTube. If you have questions as we go, use the questions button. We will have a couple of polls today, so be ready for those. If I don't get to all of the questions, we will include the questions and the answers in the email where you get your certificate for attending. And as part of that, you'll receive your certificate of attendance, but you need to attend a minimum of 35 minutes. Or if you have to jump off for a reason and you watch the recording, just send us an email and we can provide you with a certificate as well. I want to start with the definition for organizational resilience as it's defined in ISO 22316. And I have to say it's a kind of a personal affront to me when I see companies or different organizations or people speaking at conferences that have come up with their own definition of organizational resilience. And what we often see is a very narrow definition where it's kind of serving whatever they're selling, or it's just really looking at what I'll say is operational risk management or operational resilience if you want to, substitute that in. But it's a very narrow focus. And so I want us to be really thinking about this definition as we go through today's webinar. And it's the ability of an organization to absorb and adapt. So it's, absorbing something without being totally impacted by it. And then, as we've been saying, as part of COVID, I think everybody's tired of the word pivot by now, but, pivoting in a new direction or a slightly different way to get done what you need. And the key focus here is in a changing environment. So we're going to be talking a lot today about change and kind of the impact of change that it has on us. We've been talking about that for the last several webinars, but again, you're going to see it that we need to be able to manage change. And so when the organization absorbs and adapts in a changing environment, it enables it to deliver its objectives and to not just survive, but also to prosper. And those two pieces are really helpful. I hope by now that you're no longer thinking about going back to normal, meaning the old normal, the way it was, but trying to get to our new normal. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today as well. I pulled up this little slide, this picture, because this was something that I used in 2020's webinars. And, talking about the year of change, and then I kind of had the assumption that 2021 was going to be more normal, but it wasn't. And I have to say that 2022 is, while we're maybe functioning in a more normal manner, we're still facing a lot of changes, and they're coming at us from all different directions. And so each of us needs to learn how to live and prosper during times of constant change. I just did a weekend away with some college friends this weekend. We kind of do an annual meetup somewhere in the world, depending on where we want to be. And this year we just went to a cabin in Wisconsin. And I finally had to stop everyone because they constantly were saying, well, before COVID and during COVID and now COVID. And it was really everything that we were talking about was kind of framed around COVID. And so you could see that there is still, even though none of our friends, we didn't lose any of our friends to COVID, that some of them lost family members, but the fact is that their whole lives have been sort of jumbled up by COVID, and everything seems to be reflected in how it relates to the beginning of the pandemic. This is something that I published. We talked about this study. I think it was in 2020, later in 2020, and I found it really interesting because they did a study on how to increase the resilience of nurses because nursing is a very stressful job and there's a lot of different changes and things that they have to account for. So, um, this organization, as it was published in the Nursing Management magazine, wanted to look at how can we make our nurses more resilient. And it's a really interesting article. And what I want to do is see if there's been any follow up from this, because obviously a lot of things changed for nurses for the worse in March of 2020. And so all of this was looking at previous to that. But we do know that frequent changes in an organization can lead to resistance or change fatigue. And part of what they were doing was trying to provide specific training so that they would become less fatigued by change. Because what we don't want, and what I'm sure you've all seen in your companies, number one, I remember when companies, the word was, we're hiring a change agent to get these things done, and that was the person everyone hated, and everybody just waited for that person to go away so they could just go back to doing what they were doing before. And so sometimes, people who are not wanting to go along with whatever the change is actually, do things intentionally, and they create disruptive behaviors, and they really try to sabotage whatever that change is because they don't want to make any change. But I think how most of us feel is just fatigued by the constant state of change and not that feeling of really not knowing. We've never been able to know what's going to happen tomorrow. But I think that most of us feel a little bit more unsettled, that we can't really count on what we expect to happen tomorrow to do that. And so what this it really results in is this idea of change fatigue. And I think, if we were in a live audience or live thing here today, I would think I would see you nodding, and I would think people, I would ask you, is this something that you're experiencing? And I think each of us, to some degree, is is feeling this change fatigue and just becoming disengaged and apathetic, even if you're not openly expressing any kind of dissent. And so I think this is something as we need to be aware of within ourselves, but we also need to be aware of with the people that we work with to see, how are they actually doing? So just to kind of get us started, I want to set the tone that, if you're going to do something to improve your organization or make it more resilient, it has to be intentional. That doesn't happen on its own. And so one of the things we know is that in more resilient organizations, they know who they are and what they stand for. And we're going to be talking about this in great detail. But this is a key thing, these three characteristics or attributes. They also operate with a fixation on speed and simplicity, meaning that they don't take forever to make decisions. They're able to make decisions, and they're trying to break things down into its simplest parts to help understand it. And finally, they are a learning organization. They work on how to make sure that everyone is learning in their environment, that they can then use that learning to innovate. And they do really, these more resilient organizations are trying to seek good ideas, really regardless of their origin. So it's not just about, top management making all of those decisions. And so I just want to challenge you. I actually was going to put this last two sentences at the end of the presentation just to kind of challenge you, but I want you to start thinking about it now. And that is, because everything's changed, the pandemic is really offering each one of us personally, by our families, as well as in our companies, to really take this and use this as an opportunity to make changes that you've wanted to do. One of the things that I, of course, been able to do is something that we've been trying to change since about 2011 or 12, which was encourage people to sign up for online blended learning. So let's, instead of going and traveling to an in-person course, since that's what we sell, but to do that on a kind of in a live online setting where everybody's meeting together for a few hours a day or whatever the schedule is. And we got a lot of pushback from that, and people were just like, we can't do that. But once they did it, they're like, oh, this is great. And the pandemic has really provided us an opportunity because now people get that they can function in that manner. It might not be the way they want to function all the time or for everything, but it is possible and it is a good learning opportunity. And so as we kind of transition from, hopefully we've all transitioned from the crisis mode of COVID and now we're dealing with just managing through it. We need to make sure that as we're kind of getting to that new normal, that we use this as an opportunity to look at what kinds of changes did we implement during the pandemic that we want to keep and that we want to keep moving. And how can we create new systems that are stronger and more flexible and are more interconnected and really more purposeful? And I think the other thing that we've, as a takeaway from all of this is, most companies have some sort of a wellness program, but I think that they're really starting to understand what that means. And it's beyond the physical wellness, it's also the mental and emotional wellness of your people if you want to keep them. So we know that organizational resilience should be a strategy, should be a strategic initiative. And I can't tell you how many times someone has asked me for, well, can you share with me a sample organizational resilience plan and a project plan for how to implement that? And this is something that really frustrates me because it isn't a project that has a beginning and an end. It's who your organization is and how you want to improve it. Every organization has its strengths and weaknesses. And what we're trying to do is use this term organizational resilience and get a greater understanding of what that looks like. What do more resilient organizations look like and how can we strengthen ourselves? And so it should be part of a strategic organizational goal. And of course, the leaders of the organization must be committed to that sustained focus, that it isn't a project that has a beginning and an end. We know that anything you do is enhanced when you intentionally implement it. But so we're going to be looking at some of those strategies that you could consider. It is a responsibility of top management, but also remember that it requires a coordinated approach and there is no single strategy or solution. It's a combination of things. You need to be able to manage change. You need to build diversity within your organization, not just with your people, but also with maybe the products or services that you provide. You need to manage risk, of course, and this is where a lot of people focus is just on the managing risk. But we're going to talk more today about how to use systems to help break down your silos. And of course, you need to be adaptive because if you do these things, then you'll be able to be more innovative. It's very hard to be innovative if you have silos, if you're, not very diverse, if you're not managing your risk or managing change. And so it really does require a coordinated approach, which is why it needs to be something that's embedded in how the organizational works as part of their strategic objectives. So we have several models. The one that we're going to be focusing on today is our organizational resilience model, and we're going to be focusing on the strategies. From January through July this year, we focused on our behaviors, and so we have done a small update to this model where we have combined our behaviors and taken a look at them from a little bit different. When we originally did this in 2017, we're like everybody else. We need to have continual improvement. And so we've been digging deeper into those behaviors. So if you missed those webinars, they are available on YouTube. You can check those out. We also have our capability assessment, which is really measuring those capabilities and using a tool to do that. And we're going to be taking a sneak peek at that tool next month. And then we have our competency model, which is for the individual. So for the leaders in your organization to be able to lead those organizational resilience initiatives. But we're going to focus today on the model, our resilience model with our strategies. So there are what we call 3 dimensions. And what we've done is really taken some of the content of ISO 22316 and bundled them together into, first off, these 3 dimensions. So we're going to be looking at the attributes and strategies through the vision of leadership and strategy, through culture and behavior, and then preparedness and managing risk. And then we're going to look at each of these 9 attributes. So there are 9 attributes or 3 attributes for each one of these dimensions. And then finally, we're not going to talk today about the enabling behaviors. That would just is too much time. But I did want to make sure that you saw that we have kind of modified this graphic and tied it to the content that we've put together on that. So let's take a look at the first dimension. The first dimension is called leadership and strategy, and it's somewhat a little bit repetitive from what I've just said. but it's enhanced when it's intentionally implemented, of course. But the behavior of your leaders is really a key contributor to how you decide to implement your strategies. And that implementation is going to be rooted in its understanding of itself and its relationship to others, which kind of ties us to that understanding context piece. So the three attributes that we're going to look at is that shared vision and clarity of purpose, understanding and influencing context, and having effective leaders and governance. So when we look at shared vision and unity of purpose, what we want to see is that the organization has a clearly articulated and understood purpose, vision, and values, which provides the clarity to decision making and strategic direction. And there are so many examples of companies who really struggled because they didn't know why they were there. And maybe they did in a big picture know why they were there, but when things kind of fell apart, what is it that we should focus on? And if you're a business continuity person and your company is very engaged in business continuity and you have your critical activities and some of those things already figured out, it's probably much easier. But everyone in the organization needs to know who they are and what they stand for and what is it that we're trying to accomplish. And so that shared purpose becomes that glue that holds the organization together. And one of the webinars we did back in either late 2020 or early 21 talked about individual purpose and the importance of that alignment between individual purpose, why you're there, what you think about the organization, and how you contribute to that. And we're going to be alluding to some of that, but there's a deep dive into that topic that we've done previously. And so when we're looking at, okay, what should our strategy be to make sure we have that shared vision and clarity of purpose? So perhaps you want to start with that you want to strengthen your identity. You want to make sure that everybody in the company is very clear about what the organization does and what its purpose is. And so because people want to belong, they want to feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. And so organizations that create that strong identity that really helps to meet that employees' needs for affiliation, the idea of social cohesion, feeling like there's purpose and meaning. They are more resilient than those that don't, and those are the companies where people don't leave because they really are feeling that they're part of something bigger. And so when you're looking at how to strengthen identity, you need to take a stance on your purpose because your purpose also helps people want to join you, want to work for you. And I know if you're in the hiring aspect or if you're trying to fill positions, and if you're trying to fill that with younger people, they are looking to find out why what are you doing for the greater world and how do we contribute to that? And so getting people to join you that are engaged in what you're doing and to stay there and to be really successful and strive is really, really important. And it really ties to making sure that when that vision, purpose, and core values are all very clear to everyone, it really helps with decision making and understanding what to do next. And your purpose really becomes kind of that North Star that everybody's following versus having to wait to be told what to do by your top management or your superiors. And so one of the ways you can really bring that purpose to life is through storytelling and having some narratives about why we're here and what we do. And there's some really good stories about how companies had to pivot with why they were there and what they were doing at the beginning of the pandemic, and how they kept people engaged because they knew how they were helping. And so when you do that, your employees are more likely commit to the organization's strategy and execution as well. So just some things that you would look to measure or that you could do to help strengthen your identity is to make sure that how your organization behaves is aligned with that shared vision and purpose versus just words on a wall and people don't actually behave that way. All the people who work for your company need to clearly understand that vision, purpose, and core values and how they contribute to it. And there needs to be that idea of that collective identity so that everyone is moving in that same direction around that overarching purpose. Employees also need to feel that their work is personally meaningful and that it's valued and that it contributes to the organization's success. And to do that, you have to make sure that their individual goals and objectives or performance piece of this are in alignment with those of the organization. To me, that's kind of a goal one is, that you've got them clearly stated and everybody feels that they're contributing. which means they have to have it part of what their job description is and how they perform with that. And then in the end, we've talked about pivoting and managing change and adapting. The organization also needs to recognize the need to reflect on and, if necessary, revise the organization's purpose, vision, and core values in response to changes both externally and internally. And when you look at organizations that haven't been successful, what you're oftentimes, especially long-term ones, what you'll see is that they just haven't felt the need to revise what they were doing. And I often give the example of Kodak, because Kodak was a more than 100-year-old company that invented the first camera on a phone, and they just buried it because they didn't want people to stop using cameras. And so they were unable to revise the organization's purpose, and so therefore Kodak is no longer the leader that they were before. So let's look at the next attribute, which is looking at you having a clear understanding of your organization's context and relationships. I don't really like the word context, but it is a word that is used in many standards, and we're kind of stuck with it. So, but you need to have a comprehensive understanding of your organization and its partners. And if you understand how all of that works together, and by the way, we're talking internally and externally, so you need to have an understanding of your people as well. But for the most part, we're looking kind of who are we, and then how do we impact outside of our own little company, the rest of our community, our country, and the world, or kind of that ecosystem piece. When you have those things solidly in place, it helps you to be able to look in the future better, and it also helps you to understand and prioritize the needs of your customers. And so more resilient organizations they tend to embed themselves more in those external networks, and they position each of their employees to take on the role of kind of being those active sensors where they're detecting and scanning and adapting to fluctuating customer needs. So we're not having, we talk sometimes about horizon scanning and that kind of thing. The fact is that your horizon scanning can be simply making sure that you're meeting the needs of your customers and what they see coming in their future. And so when we have unpredictable times like we've been in, the organization's survival itself oftentimes depends on understanding that broader external environment and making sure that your purpose and goals are targeted to your customers' missions, to make sure that they're all in alignment, you're providing what they need, and then that becomes that focus to rally your leadership and teams as well. So if your strategy is we need to strengthen our relationships, you're going to want to make sure that you understand the importance of collaborating and strengthening relationships with anybody that, your relevant interested parties, whatever you want to call them, that help you support with the delivery of your purpose and your mission. And so you need to make sure that you've sharpened your value agenda. And this is something that McKinsey says quite often. But understand, where are we creating value in the world? What sets our company apart from the other companies that do something similar to us? And really understanding that and its relationship with your competitors and your partners and your suppliers is going to help you make more effective decisions about your priorities for resilience as well. And so to do that, you need to have that ecosystem view. So you need to look at your networks and how you share information and skills, and how when you work together that you can create value and create higher levels of value. So when we look at some of those things, the organization is going to need to maintain strong relationships with its interested parties. You need to foster cooperation and collaboration at all levels. You're going to need to make sure you're seeking partnerships, sometimes even outside your traditional boundaries when it's needed, in order to deliver its strategy and support the achievement of its purpose and objectives. Again, we're back to, what does the organization do? How do we do that? You also need to make sure that your employees feel connected to others at work, and provide opportunities for employees to get to know one another and to develop interpersonal relationships across the organization. And then you need to make sure that those investments, and what are you going to do improvements, are going to be appropriate to the organization's internal and external context. So understanding your context becomes really important aspect of strengthening your relationships and vice versa. And just like we said before, you need to monitor and evaluate your context. What's changing? Do we have new interdependencies? Are there new political challenges we need to deal with? Are there new regulations? and what are our competitors doing, and looking at that under those changing circumstances. The last piece under leadership and strategy is looking at your effective leaders and governance. So your leaders need to be effective, of course. They need to be also trusted, respected, and they need to act with integrity. And that's a big deal. They also need to promote unity in the organization and an understanding, again, we're tying this back to an understanding of the organization's purpose, because sometimes you can get different divisions or departments of a company really competing against each other for budgets and different things. And you lose that sense of unity when the organization is having a conflict within itself. And so to do this, you need to have leaders at all levels of the organization that foster an environment for high performing teams and for really helping the organization to perform at a higher level. And understanding that leadership is, of course, responsible for demonstrating governance and accountability on the organization's resilience capability itself. So it is the responsibility of top management, as we said at the beginning, but they need to manage doing the governance aspects of this and ultimately be accountable. And so when we look at how you might strengthen leaders to have, a more effective leaders and governance in your organization, the organization needs to actually seek leaders who have a diverse set of skills. So when we're talking about diversity, we're talking about a lot of things: your skill sets, your different leadership styles, different knowledge sets, and different experience. And I'll say even different age levels, and of course, different cultures to get those perspectives. But, experiences are important as well because they do drive our decision making. And so the organization needs to really intentionally seek leaders who are able to adapt to changing circumstances and leaders who can change their leadership styles to meet whatever the situation is. So you need to develop your leaders. You need to make sure that your leaders also develop, encourage others to lead under that range of circumstances and conditions. And so just helping your leaders develop is a key aspect of strengthening your leaders, as well as look at how your leaders are distributed, because you want to have, I'm sure if you've heard of anything that ICOR has been talking about, we've talked about structure and decentralization, which we're going to talk more about coming up. But you need to make sure that your leaders at all levels of the organization are empowered to make decisions and that protect and enhance the resilience of the organization. And so just making sure that leadership isn't just at the top. Sometimes we say top management for a reason, but we also need to have leaders at every level of the organization. And so one of the things that organizations can do to strengthen their leaders is to help them improve their emotional intelligence and how they adapt to changing circumstances. So going back to that nursing, there are specific trainings that can be offered to help people to learn how to manage change and to be less stressed from change. But the leaders also need to encourage, incorporate those broad sets of ideas and get input from other people. Nothing is really more frustrating than when leaders ask for input and then they just say, okay, thank you, and they don't do anything with it. So they need to make sure that they're not just encouraging input, but also incorporating that input. That really is how you build trust and collaboration. And we talked about innovation earlier this year, and the fact that sometimes innovation requires healthy conflict. And so making sure that you're encouraging healthy conflict, because you can't have a diverse workforce that doesn't have conflict, because you're going to have different ideas. And so people need to be able to listen to each other and work through why somebody's thinking that way, and really listen, because we need to treat employees fairly, and not just when we're having discussions about things, but also when allocating resources and making decisions. That's how you get the trust built. And so to do that, you need to make sure that you have open lines of communication, that there's a give and receive feedback in the workplace, that feedback is listened to, and that the leaders do their best to implement whatever changes come out of that. And to do that, there needs to be a direct link between the managers and the employees. There needs to be that communication link and not that bureaucracy that's in the way. Because we know, again, that leaders they are responsible for the governance and accountability. So I want to take our first poll, and what I'd like to do is you to think about which of the three leadership strategies do you think would be a benefit to your organization to implement. This is only going to be about 30 seconds. So somebody said they only have audio and no visual, so I think that's on your end. A question came, would this also include buy-in like continuity? Of course. And also thank you that recognizing an alignment with the Canadian Psychological Health and Safety Standards. Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. So I'm going to close the poll and share it with you. So it looks like 60% of you, wow, that's really interesting, that 60% of you feel that you need to strengthen relationships. And I would say that everybody always feels we need to strengthen leaders. But it's kind of nice to see that only 5% of you feel that you need to strengthen identity. So for the most part, the people here are feeling that you know what your organization stands for and what it does and your contribution, but you need to look at maybe how you relate with the rest of the world and the community. So thank you for that. That was interesting. That wasn't what I was expecting. So let's look next at culture and behavior. So we know that organizational resilience is increased when there's an intentional effort to ensure a healthy culture throughout the organization. And I have worked for companies. I remember when I first moved to Chicago as a young person, I was transferring from a job in Minnesota where I was working kind of for a nonprofit association of collection agencies, which was a great job as a young person to have while I was going to school. And when I moved to Chicago, they transferred me to one of their collection agencies so that I would have a job. And it was the worst place I have ever worked in my entire life. Now, you might think that because it's a collection agency, so maybe the culture wouldn't be great anyways. But just because you have a difficult job doesn't mean it can't be a good place to work. I got out of there within 2 months. Luckily, I was able to find something else. But culture is very important. And that includes that commitment to that, having those shared beliefs and values. People are positive and they behave in a good way. And so we're going to look at the impact of a healthy culture, shared information and knowledge, and continual improvement and evaluation. So of course we know that the behavior of organizations leadership is again really a key contributor to how it implements its organizational resilience strategies, but also how it impacts the culture. And leadership serves as a role model for that. And it also serves as a mechanism for shaping behavior because, one of the definitions of culture is, it's the way we do things around here. And it's also the way we don't do those things around here either. So it really helps shape that behavior. And so because leadership is responsible for creating a culture that fosters creativity and innovation, you need to have leaders that are effective and trusted and respected and that act with integrity. So that really goes with making sure you have effective leaders. And we need to nurture and retain talent by really fostering that inclusive employee experience where we recognize and reward performance. And we also have those wellness and mentoring programs, which I don't think anybody should take a job if you don't have a wellness program for your company because, unless you're a very small company, because that's how you help improve your culture. A lot of people say that culture is your secret sauce and, that its main ingredients are those behaviors that are observable that everybody at all levels is supposed to adhere to. Because the culture helps provide that sense of identity that ties to the organization's purpose, it really promotes that sense of commitment and reinforces the values of the organization. So if your strategy is we need to improve our culture, one of the things that you could do is engage your people at all levels because, take your culture and use it as a tool to build and strengthen your trust. And that maybe that means you have to change some of your leadership in order to do that. If there's people that are really negatively impacting your culture, it doesn't really matter how effective they are if they're hurting in other ways. I fired the best employee we ever had work-wise, but she was poison to our team, and it just wasn't going to happen. It was like either she had to go or I had to go. So I decided that she had to go. But it isn't just about the work that you do, it's how you behave in the workplace. And so leaders need to behave in a manner that strengthens trust. And you need people who are also able to embrace change to do that. And so making sure that your leaders are encouraging inclusive behaviors, things such as mentorship, being impartial to people, having a way to advocate. When you're looking at team building, really offering encouragement, because a lot of times people are afraid to make decisions. So we're talking about kind of training up your leaders, helping them to learn to make decisions, but also, encouraging people to share is the first step of that. And they need to feel empowered to do that. And as a leader in your organization, no matter where you are in the organization, just being compassionate and sharing concern for others and looking at that integration of those diverse ideas. And so what I hope you're starting to see is how each of these attributes are sort of tied to each other. We're kind of putting them in buckets so that we can talk about them, but they're really all part of, making the organization a good place to work. And so you need to build that culture of trust and growth by providing encouragement and motivation to people. You need to make sure your employees themselves value and embrace diversity. So this is part of the hiring piece as well. So to look at our diversity and integration webinar for that. And then helping to foster creativity and innovation, because this really encourages people to communicate. And we need to make sure that people are able to communicate in your company, both vertically and horizontally. And that's why we talk about having as flat an organization as you can so that you don't have that bureaucracy in the way of effective communication. Leadership needs to make sure that their employees are embraced and empowered to make meaningful contribution and that they're recognized for that. And so looking at showing appreciation for the work that they're doing, but also for their non-work, and understanding that people have lives outside of work. And this is becoming a grayer line as we're seeing more and more people working virtually. That um, where does this end, and where does work end, and my family or my other parts of my life begin when you're in the same place. Um, but again, making sure that the company is engaging all of its people to promote the organization's values. Shared information and knowledge is something that I have always thought was really, really important. But the more I study it, the more I realize that it really needs to be intentional. And it doesn't really happen unless it's intentional. And so just widely sharing knowledge, again, we kind of qualify that with appropriate. Not everybody needs to know everything, but certainly the right people need to know things. And also being able to learn from the experiences that you're having and learning from others. And if it isn't done intentionally, it just doesn't happen. And so, in order to do that, knowledge and information needs to be recognized as a critical resource of the organization. And that the organization really needs to value that information, knowledge, and learning itself. To do that, you have to be able to create, retain, and apply that knowledge through those established systems and processes. I keep mentioning other webinars, but we have done one on knowledge and information and what that looks like and what those systems look like. And it also needs to be accessible, understandable, and adequate. And I know that you with so many of the tools that we have, just shared docs and all those systems that we have, if you use tools like Microsoft Teams and other tools that create that ability for people to access things and be able to share things is one of those tools. So if your strategy is to increase your information sharing and learning, it needs to be intentional. And when you do that, it also increases cooperation and collaboration within your organization. And you need to make sure that your learning is being drawn from all available sources. So to do that, you need to foster learning, you need to foster creativity and innovation. And as part of that then, you need to value error reporting, and that your learning is more important from making a mistake than blame is. And there's tons of examples, and I can't get into them today just because of time, but where people have hidden their mistakes because they know they're going to get in trouble for making the mistake instead of being recognized for bringing a vulnerability to the attention of management so that it doesn't happen again. So again, we need people to be able to communicate their ideas throughout the organization, vertically and horizontally, and that knowledge and information needs to be shared in a timely manner so that it helps with decision making. And so as part of that, you need to be a learning organization. This idea that that your organization is one of continuous learning, and that you're encouraging and support people really even to readapt and reinvent themselves as we're managing change. So the first step is, like we said earlier, you need to value information, knowledge, and learning, and making sure it's accessible, understandable, and adequate to support your objectives. You need to make sure that you're creating, retaining, and applying that knowledge through established systems, that there's a way to do it that you understand, and making sure that you're providing opportunities for learning and professional development, because this does create a positive work environment. And when your company is committed to investing in its people, you feel valued as well. And to do that, you need to have the organization itself needs to have an understanding of how work occurs, and ensuring that the links between workplace and workers are understood. And this is where you can do sort of that dependency and interdependency mapping to help with some of that, or process mapping. That your learning is being drawn from all available sources. And that's why that diverse workforce and having those partners in place becomes really important. And doing that environmental scanning so that you can see kind of what's changing and what's out there, and bringing that back in to share with others. And then making sure that you have a formal way to both create and share lessons learned, both about your successes and your failures, because this helps us to move in a positive direction. Our final one under culture and behavior talks about continual improvement and evaluation. Sometimes I write continual improvement and innovation because I feel like you should be taking that improvements to innovate. But here we kept it with the evaluation. So we need to have that culture of continual improvement, and that we're evaluating how we're doing in order to improve how we're doing. And so to do that, you need to continually monitor your performance against that predetermined criteria. So whether it's a performance appraisal for people or your department or your team or division or your larger company, you really need to do that in order to improve and take advantage of your opportunities. And so when you do that, that culture of continual improvement really helps you to keep systems in place that support all the changing needs of your organization. So if your strategy is, in order to make decisions and continually to improve, we need to know what's happening. So that means strengthening data collection becomes a really important aspect of that, because data should be used to continually empower your decisions as well as your value agenda. And so more resilient organizations use tools like predictive analytics and performance management to be able to operate as agilely as possible, and making sure that your people are also analyzing their performance. And by the way, the day of the annual performance review is out the window. This should be happening continuously, but formally as well. So you need to build data-rich systems for managing change, for managing improvement, as well as for innovation. And so making sure that you've got systems in place that help you anticipate, plan, and respond to change, and that you're using monitoring reports to track trends in your data used to evaluate organizational resilience. And one of my kids is a data analytics person, and I tell you, if you don't speak in data language to make decisions, she wants nothing to do with you. So why are you making that decision? What is it based on? And I think sometimes we go too much with what we feel, and that needs to be really, those feelings really need to be validated with data. And so making sure you're doing continuous assessment, that you're taking that knowledge, that data that you're collecting, and creating knowledge out of it for both learning, improvement, and innovation. So one of the things that top management needs to do is to determine objectives and measurement criteria in order to monitor and evaluate the status of your organization and all of its resilience attributes and indicators. That it needs to routinely review the suitability, availability, and allocation of its resources. And again, looking at what's changed with anything in our context, and how does that impact how we allocate resources. So you're going to need to make sure that you're using and monitoring reports and trends to do that in any available data that you have, and that you take the output of that reporting to identify gaps in your capabilities and to develop action. Here's where you can have action plans in order to close those gaps. So your organizational resilience should be a strategy that then you put together plans to close some of those gaps, and you identify opportunities for improvement. And you should be using as much technology as you can for this, to automate, automate, automate. Do whatever you can to help collect that data so that you can make more informed decisions. So let's go to our next poll. And this one, what I'd like you to do is to think about which of these strategies do you think is a strength in your organization. So the last one kind of looked at what should you work on, In this case, we're looking at what is a strength you feel competent about. So one of the comments that was made in the questions tab was that when you strengthen your identity, it's really helpful when you're holding different companies or many separate firms together. And it's really something you need to do when you have a merger or acquisition because your whole identity is kind of flipped on its head. So give you about 5 more seconds. All right, this is really interesting to me too, is that when I clicked the improving culture and increasing information sharing and learning tied. And so it looks like many of you are already, your companies are already doing a pretty decent job with data collection. So kudos to you. That's great to hear. Our last part of the model is looking at preparedness and managing risk. And I always put this last because, most of our audience are people who are in the preparedness and managing risk line of business. And so this is something that you know the most about. But we really were very specific when we looked at preparedness and managing risk is tied to having your resources. Of course, it's looking at managing risk, but it's also looking at managing change. And so we all know that we need to manage risk and prepare for the unexpected. And we really need to have alignment and collaboration between the systems. And some people say risk-based systems, and I left risk-based systems in here for this piece, but we're going to make that much broader when we talk in a few minutes. Because I think it's really alignment to all systems because all the different systems in your organization manage risk in some way. So we're going to look at these 3 attributes. So the first one is having, in this case, we say available resources, but we want to make sure that you're developing and allocating resources and that those resources are not just available, but they're also adequate, and looking at things like people, premises, technology, finance, information, all sorts of different resources. In order to address any vulnerabilities so that you can, again, provides that ability to adapt to changing circumstances. So your resources need to be adequate and available when needed. We also need to manage it in an agile manner so that you've got the right people. If you're talking about people resources, that they're on the right teams at the right time. So being able to be more agile in how you manage all parts of your resources. So if your strategy is that you want to build for adequate and available resources, management is typically responsible for that. And they really are responsible for making sure you have what you need. And so in addition to being available, they need to be assigned and they need to be competent. So making sure that leadership has assigned roles, responsibilities, and the authority levels for enhancing resilience and ensuring that those assigned are competent, are able to work on an interdisciplinary team, and they're able to collaborate and communicate effectively. One of my friends went on a hiking trip with some family members, extended family members, and they they were trying to climb some mountain ranges in outside of Seattle, Washington in the US. And she had not been with these people before. And 2 of them, there were 4 of them, and 2 of them decided they were going to set the pace, which was too fast for the other 2, or at least one of them couldn't keep up the pace, and make all the decisions about where they went each day. And so this idea of being able to work on an interdisciplinary team, the 2 people who kind of were leading that effort are people who work alone that have never even played on a sporting team. And so it was really evident that they didn't know how to work on a team. And so it really, for that stupid little hiking trip, they actually failed in their hiking trip and they had to leave because they weren't working together as a team and it became too dangerous. So making sure that your resources are not just available and assigned and competent, but that they can work with other people. You have to be able to do that in order to work under these new conditions. So some of the things that you need to do is making sure that using diversification, replication, and redundancy to really avoid single points of failure with some of your maybe more hardware and software and technology types of resources, that you're able to move people to different projects when they're needed so that your teams themselves can be flexibly distributed when you need to be moving in a different direction. And here where we talk about being available that all employees should have equal access to the information and opportunities and relationships. So here's again where culture and leadership sort of plays into resources as well. And we've seen examples, and I'm really looking forward to starting to read some case studies. Hopefully they'll start coming out on how organizations have applied existing resources to new purposes during the pandemic with that whole pivot piece. But to do this effectively, like everything else, you need to review routinely the suitability, availability, and allocation of those resources, and looking at it through the lens of what's changed. And then making sure that the leadership makes sure that the resources it has are focused on the right initiatives with the best potential to increase the organization's value and values themselves. Well, I said we were going to talk about managing change. This whole thing has been about managing change, but we're going to specifically look at the importance of managing change. And you need to have systems in place to help you do that. So more resilient organizations actually have a commitment to managing change. And they are looking at how they can take that agile management process for projects and software and different things and move that to a broader context of change management for the whole organization, which really helps the organization to be able to manage under changing circumstances and adapt its operations. So if your strategy is you're going to build to be more speedy and more agile, you need to have operating models that allow you to do that and that create ways of working that foster that idea of agility and simplicity, keeping things as simple as possible, which means you need your teams to be networked. So back to that, having more of a flatter structure where people are interacting with each other and making sure everybody has access to the same knowledge and information. And getting down to the edge, meaning that you need to include everybody because those employees that are closest to the customers are going to have a much better idea of what the customer needs are to be able to share that information, both vertically and horizontally in the organization. And so what you need to do is really look at your organizational structure and making sure that you're structured for high performance and to best manage change. And we know that the more complex your organization, the harder it is to do that. So what we recommend is flatten where you can. There are things that maybe you can't do, but really flatten as you can and try to design that workplace that is both flexible and productive. So as many people, if you're working in an office, you're now working remotely and you're now working remotely because your office doesn't exist anymore. We talk about workplaces. I think we're going to see in the next year or two some moderation of that because I think we're going to need companies to be able to be innovative and creative and collaborative, which isn't is easily done um, when you're all distant from each other. And so I was excited yesterday. I got to go to a meeting where we met with four of us, just met in person for a 2-hour meeting that we've been having over conference calls, and we accomplished more in that in-person meeting, even though we ate during the meeting, than we have for months and months and months. And so I think what people are going to see is that they still need to see each other and that just being with each other helps with that. And so looking at this idea of workplace and cross-functional teams and having clear and accountable roles is very important. But looking at, how we do the work is also important. So look at your structure and making sure that you're aware of situations that are likely to influence change. And so looking at environmental scanning and monitoring, and having that bias to action, where you're valuing speed and making a decision versus focusing on the risk. And well, we don't have all that we know. We can't make a decision yet because we don't know everything. Well, you're not going to know everything ever. So you need to make a decision based on the knowledge and information that you have right now instead of waiting for it to be perfect. So some of the things you need to be able to do is to be aware of circumstances that are likely to change. You need to be able to adapt yourself without significant impact to your products and services. And then really understanding, kind of going back to what we talked about at the very beginning, what are the causes of change resistance? Why is it that people don't want to change in the ways that we say that we need to? And so when there is change resistance, you need to acknowledge that and try to really use what they call a strong change narrative, but really tell the story of why this change is necessary and what they'll get out of it. what's in it for you type of thing to go along versus resist. Your organization also needs to understand how its structure and design impacts its agility, and really to look at it carefully to see how well does our structure and design allow us to collaborate and communicate in both directions of the organization, so that we can have the kind of shorter chains of command or lines of authority, so that there's more delegation. We talked about being able to delegate and having people empowered. You can't do that if you have really long lines of authority and chains of command. And so the ultimate thing that you're trying to do is to allow those responsible for responding to and managing an incident itself be able to switch from one design to another if needed. So a lot of times what you'll see in companies is that your crisis management team is very reflective of your org chart. And in other ones, it isn't. It's much more reflective on how your teams are set up. So just looking at that to see, are we built for speed and agility, and what can we do to be better at that? The last one is the one that most of you probably are the most familiar with, is managing risk. And there's many ways to manage risks, but we need to manage risk both from sudden and gradual changes to our internal and external environments. So you have to have systems in place to do that, and you have to have a capability also to do that. So let's look at a couple of those things. So the strategy could be that we're going to develop a systems approach. What we're going to do is to try to reduce our silos or eliminate silos altogether. So where do we have barriers among our functions or between our teams? Where is it that we're stuck? And so looking at having that systems approach to all ways of managing risk becomes really important. And so this is where top management needs to make sure that there's that capability to both design and develop those systems to increase preparedness. And so obviously, companies or organizations that are more prepared are more prepared. I just sort of said that I didn't mean that to come out that way, but if you prepare, you're going to be more likely to be successful. And so to do that, what we're suggesting is that you need to have alignment and collaboration of your systems. So what I've done is I've taken a kind of 3 or 4 graphics that we've been using in past webinars and kind of tried to put them together into something that we're calling the 3 pillars of systems-based thinking. And a lot of times what we're hearing is operational resilience or operational risk management. And so I'm suggesting that we're looking at systems for operations. And there are going to be things that you're probably familiar with, things like incident response and business continuity, crisis management, supply chain management. Under that technology pillar, we're looking at your data centers and critical environments, how you manage your technology continuity, your data storage and availability, and of course, your information and cybersecurity. The ones you may not have thought about so much are your systems for management, things like asset management, quality management systems, finance management systems, your talent management systems all become very important. And there's things that you can add here, but for the purpose of this, we were just kind of looking at 4 types of things that might be under each one of these pillars or each one of these systems. So really that design, development, coordination of these systems and their alignment with strategic objectives is really fundamental to building that resilience capability. So with your systems approach, you need to make sure that your methods of managing risk are effective and robust and respond to change, that you've identified and looked at different systems that contribute to your resilience and that help to manage the risk across all of its systems, that there's a coherent approach between these systems and making sure there's adequate communication, coordination, and cooperation, that those systems are coordinated so that individually and collectively contribute to the organization's purpose and protection of what it values, that you've got your structures and your roles and responsibilities for rapid gathering, collation, and sharing and use of that data that's collected on behalf of these systems. And that, of course, leadership, again, regularly assesses how each system contributes to the overall resilience of the organization and tries to address weaknesses where those found. And so this might become a project. Each one of these things could have a beginning and an end as part of that. Because the organization ultimately needs to empower its people to identify and communicate threats and opportunities in order to take action that'll benefit the organization. So I have one last poll, and I knew that if I added polls, that we were going to run over by a couple of minutes, so I apologize. Let's do this last poll. And the question really is, which one of the preparedness strategies do you think would have the most significant impact on your organization? And I'm only going to give you about 10 seconds to do this. Sorry about that. All right. So ironically, it's almost evenly split. So implementing a systems approach is one that I'm happy to see on here. Maybe perhaps that you're already have somewhat of a systems approach, which is good, but also the building for adequate and available resources. You know, the biggest complaint that people have is I don't have the resources to do what's expected of me. And that's a big deal. And I'm sure you also feel it's a big deal, and it results in a lot of stress. So yeah, 34% and 38% for those two. So that's pretty even if you're looking at the logistics of things. So I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. And just to finish up, kind of in summary, if you're wanting to look at kind of the big picture, when you're looking at different strategies, you need to consider your people and how you recruit and build a flexible and dynamic teams, and how you seek talent that's creative, collaborative, and curious. Secondly, you need to look at your structure itself. You know, is our structure in a place that helps us to communicate and work and make informed decisions? And finally, do our processes or systems work together to enable information sharing and promote teamwork and learning and development as well? We have 3 more webinars to finish out the year. Next month, we're going to look at our organizational resilience capability assessment. In October, we're going to revisit the understanding the resilience of community and really looking at it through the lens of the pandemic, because it does matter, and where you live has impacted our lives. And then in December, we have guest speakers that are going to come in and talk to you about your crisis management capability. And we are working on a new international standard, a guidance document on crisis management communications that'll be part of that discussion. Just as a reminder, we do have courses that teach you about how to be a leader in organizational resilience. We do have our assessment tool for helping assess your organization, and please follow us to learn more. Appreciate your coming. I think the only other question that was in was just a couple of comments. So thank you for sharing those, and hopefully we'll see you next month.